Recently, I've been watching a ton of The Vampire Diaries and genuinely having the best time, however cringe or problematic it may be. But one thing I keep asking myself while watching is, where are all the gay vampires? Over the last few years, I have been fiending for the perfect queer vampire book, and I'm really hoping that my current read will really satisfy that craving. But before we get into that, I kind of fell down a rabbit hole of researching the history of the modern day vampire and its very queer roots. So I hope you'll come along on this journey with me, maybe learn something new, or just get a new perspective on some of your favorite vampire-related media. So vampires have existed in folklore around the world for centuries. They were often depicted as monstrous, hideous creatures, and it wasn't until they began appearing in literature throughout the 1800s that they became what we know today: sexy, seductive beings that hide in plain sight. Many only know Bram Stoker's Dracula as the original vampire novel, but two notable works came before it. In 1819, 78 years before Dracula, John Polidori's The Vampire was published. This is truly where the modern vampire began. Rumored to have been based on Lord Byron, the vampire in this story was a handsome young aristocrat with the power of seduction over both men and women. Next came Carmilla, written by J. Sheridan Le Fanu in 1872, still 25 years before Dracula, and this one was a blatant queer representation, with the lesbian vampire Carmilla seducing a young woman. Since they first appeared in works like these, vampires have pretty much always been queer-coded and often have coercive powers over both sexes. Even Dracula has queer roots. While not overtly queer, it's widely theorized that Bram Stoker was a closeted gay man, and the book itself is full of homoerotic subtext, with Dracula as a symbol for Stoker's and the rest of society's fear of being seduced into homosexual relations. But if stories with overt queer elements had any hope of being published in this period, the queer characters had to be punished in some way. These characters needed to be depicted as monsters, as the devil, inevitably meeting their demise by the end of the story. It's hard to say if these authors were themselves queer and trying to express their concealed identities within the constraints of publication, or if they genuinely wanted to portray queer people as predatory monsters. Or maybe in most cases it's both. Like Stoker, these authors may have been wrestling with their own desires and funneled that fear into internalized homophobia. The very idea of the vampire is so obviously a metaphor for sexual deviance. They're overly sexy and seductive, and they can easily coerce you into doing whatever they please against your will and your nature, and then they turn you into one of them. At the time that these original vampire stories were being written, and honestly still today, there was a real fear that homosexuality could be caught, that your sons or daughters could fall ill with this disease by being around another homosexual person. And so we did what humans do, turned our fears into a monster that can be slain. In addition to the queer undertones, the image of the vampire also has strong roots in xenophobia and racism. 19th century Britain was rife with anti-Eastern European sentiment, particularly targeting the Roma and Jewish populations. So it's no surprise that vampires like Dracula or Nosferatu are depicted as foreign, often with strong Slavic accents. The other was something to be demonized and feared. Vampire depictions of the modern day have had their fair share of queer characters, and even more queer-coded characters. There are shows like True Blood, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, What We Do in the Shadows, and AMC's Interview with the Vampire. Then there are movies like the 1994 Interview with the Vampire, The Lost Boys, and even the original vampire film of 1922, Nosferatu, had strong themes of homoerotic desire, with the director allegedly being a gay man. However, these depictions are often overshadowed in pop culture by their straight counterparts like Twilight or The Vampire Diaries, but even the straightest of vampire depictions have some sort of queer undertone. Take The Vampire Diaries. While none of the main vampire cast is queer, there is a plotline where Caroline's dad basically performs electric shock therapy on her to exorcise the vampire within her, in a not so subtle metaphor for conversion therapy. What's even weirder about this plotline is that Caroline is a fully straight character while her dad is an out gay man, so I don't really know what their logic with this one is, but still, you can't escape the parallels. And don't even try to tell me that Alice from Twilight is not a lesbian, because come on. So clearly we've established that vampires are a symbol for queerness. Both queer people themselves and those afraid of queer people are drawn to the vampire. Although it began as a symbol for the dangers of queer relationships, painting queer people as devilish creatures, it's clear that queer people today are taking back the symbol for their own empowerment. And I do think writers and creators have some sort of responsibility to not add to the image of the vampire that paints queer people and other marginalized groups as monsters or predatory. And don't get me wrong, I do think it's fun to see gay people doing crimes. Like, we can be bad people too, just like anybody else. What We Do in the Shadows is one of my favorite shows of all time, and those bisexual vampires are pieces of shit. I think the very loose line I draw is with the context of the media. What We Do in the Shadows is a comedy. The vampires are satirical satirical versions of the classic vampire, with all of their character traits turned up to the max. But when a piece of media is trying to be subversive or deep or have a message, I think it's important to analyze what that message is, and also how it adds or takes away from the mainstream image of queer people. Okay, now that we have a little bit of context, let's get into my experience with vampires in literature. I've read a few queer vampire books, but none have really wowed me. I mean, obviously Carmilla is the blueprint, and the explicit depiction of a lesbian relationship was unheard of for the day, but it is hard for me to get past the fact that Carmilla is so obviously portrayed as a predatory, dangerous monster that needs to be killed in order to protect other women from her seductive powers. The next one I read after Carmilla was A Dowry of Blood, which is a loose retelling of Dracula from the wife's perspective. And honestly, I did not love this one. The queer relationship involved to me was just very weird. They call each other sisters, but then have sex, but also most of the time they're having a threesome with Dracula, so I don't know. That's not really a criticism of the book itself, it's more that it just was not the book for me. And I was expecting it to be a lot gayer just based on how it was marketed. And then we have Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil, the biggest disappointment of all. This one hurt since I genuinely love V.E. Schwab's writing most of the time, but yeah, this one was not it. Plant-Based Bride has a really great video about this book and how it's such a poor representation for both feminism and queerness, and I very much agree with everything that she said in that video. Definitely just go watch that video if you want a really in-depth analysis of this book and what went wrong. But basically, it's just 500 pages of women gaining their freedom from men only to turn around and victimize women instead. So yeah, just was not my favorite. I definitely don't think this is a very good example of queer people reclaiming the image of the vampire. Honestly, I just think it further perpetuates lesbian stereotypes. So after the big bummer that was Bury Our Bones, I've really been looking for just a good, empowering queer vampire book, and I have one more on my list that just came out this year that I'm praying will do it for me, and that is Hungerstone by Kat Dunn. This is a retelling of J. Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, so I'm really excited to get a modern author's take on that original story. I loved every element of Carmilla except the ending where the vampire had to die, spoiler alert, so I'm really hoping that this will give me the Carmilla that I wanted, with maybe a happy ending, or at the very least, I just hope it doesn't paint queer people as monsters. So we'll see. I'm really excited to get into this. I am going to start reading and I'll check back whenever I have updates.
You drove a dagger through my back, Elena. It hurt.
Okay, so I have finished Hungerstone and I have a few thoughts. I'm gonna start with my thoughts on this book outside of the context of this video, because taken at face value, there's a lot that I really enjoyed about this book. Like I said, it was marketed as a Carmilla retelling. I would say the word retelling is being used pretty loosely here, because from what I remember of the original story, this is very different. The beginning starts the same though, with Lenore having a nightmare about a presence in her room. Her and her husband Henry then travel to their new summer home in the country, and along the way they come across a woman who has just been in a carriage crash, so they take her in while she recovers. Of course, we find out that this woman's name is Carmilla, and she won't say where she was going when the carriage crashed or if she has any other friends and family that she can stay with. She is extremely mysterious, and this both frightens and allures Lenore. Carmilla's smile widens, her incisors slipping over her bottom lip, and she looks upon me so warmly it is as though though I am now the fire, for so greatly do I burn with something I cannot name. But from there, the book takes its own course, and it's clearly trying to subvert the plot and meaning of the original story, where Carmilla is a story about a young girl being seduced and weakened by a monster. Hungerstone is a story of a woman taking back her power to earn her freedom and live her life the way she wants to live it, not the way society expects her to. There's a lot of setup in the beginning about Lenore's relationship to her husband, as well as her relationship to womanhood and her role in society. It's obvious right from the start that her husband Henry is horrible. He expects her to do everything to get this old, dilapidated manor in shape for guests in just a few weeks. He has given her this impossible role of being both a lady and perfect wife, while not allowing her to act like other women who supposedly let their emotions and inherent weakness control them. Because of this pressure, Lenore resents being a woman and feels very trapped, but she does her best to fulfill this role anyway because she doesn't see any alternative. There's this moment right at the beginning where Lenore is having a very painful period, which is a reminder of her womanhood and her place in society, but it's also a reminder that another month has passed without her producing a son for her husband. I will not sleep again. The pain woke with me, so instead I furl myself in the quilt like an oyster in its shell, with no pearl to show for the grit that works through it. Pain and blood, grief and hunger. To be a woman is a horror I can little comprehend. I also wanted to touch a little on Lenore's relationship to the other female character, Cora. I honestly still don't know how I feel about the portrayal of this relationship. For most of the book, Lenore has this I'm not like other girls attitude, especially towards Cora, whom she views as society's ideal woman, and because of that, she sees her as fake. And only at the very end does Lenore feel a little bit guilty for how she's treated her and misunderstood her. And I had just hoped that we were going to get a little bit more of an arc with Lenore realizing who the real enemy is. And Cora is definitely not without faults, but the main reasons that Lenore hates her are completely out of her control. So yeah, I just think that the book could have done a lot more to get into the nuance of this relationship, and the idea that as women, we're taught to turn our anger towards other women, instead of blaming the men who are actually responsible, or blaming the patriarchy as a whole. And I don't think the author was trying to be misogynistic in this portrayal of Cora, but honestly to me it just did come across that way. And in terms of female empowerment as a whole, I'm just not sure this book is really doing anything revolutionary. It's still just a happy ending for one individual woman who kind of puts down other women to get what she wants. And I definitely think this is a big improvement from the violence against women portrayed in Bury Our Bones, but that is a pretty low bar. Another main theme throughout this book is industrialization and workers' rights, which started out interesting, but I just think this could have been expanded on so much more. It kind of felt like these ideas were only included to paint Henry as more of a monster, rather than actually saying anything about workers' rights. But anyway, back to what I liked. The writing was genuinely gorgeous. I absolutely loved the lyrical prose in this. I know I'm comparing this book a lot to Bury Our Bones, so sorry about that, but in my opinion, this writing style is what V.E. Schwab was trying to do in Bury Our Bones, but for me, it just fell flat in that book. But this one is flowery in a way that makes sense for the time period it's set in, the late 1800s, and the metaphors are actually smart and make sense and add something meaningful to the reading experience. Okay, now I want to get into what this video is all about, the queer vampires, and I'm going to get into slight spoilers in this section, so fair warning. At face value, just looking at the plot, I do think this is a really good twist on the original Carmilla story, and it did what I was hoping it would do. It took the vampire archetype of a predator and turned it into a vessel of power for our main character. In the original story, Carmilla is the one that's making our main character weak and sick, but in this one we find out that Henry is actually the one that's poisoning Lenore, and I really love this change. It really drives home the fact that Henry is the true monster here. And I know Carmilla is not 100% good, obviously. She uses extremely unethical methods to help Lenore, and she's very much unhinged, but this is exactly what it takes to defeat someone as powerful as Henry. So as a plot device, I liked the vampire element, but these definitely were not central to the story, which kind of disappointed me. It was more like Carmilla was this unspecified supernatural being, rather than being an obvious vampire. We only got a few scenes of her actually drinking Lenore's blood, and even in those, I was still a little bit confused why it was happening, because she's clearly trying to help Lenore. Carmilla also goes away from the house at night, and it's not clear where she goes or what she does, and I really just wish we would have gotten a chapter or two from Carmilla's perspective, so we could have just gotten inside her head, and also gotten more scenes of her actually doing vampire stuff. It seems like her main vampire power is the ability to compel people into doing things they would never do otherwise, and I really like these scenes. They had the perfect gory, nasty horror vibe to them, but I just really wanted more of this, especially since this is a horror book. Instead, the same two scenes were brought up again and again, and it it just got a little repetitive. And obviously having Lenore just recounting these events don't have the same effect as having new horrific scenes play out. So yeah, overall with the vampire and horror elements, I just wanted more, and I wanted it to be a lot grosser and weirder. I mean, for a vampire book, this has very little blood. And now let's talk about the sapphic elements. I started out absolutely loving where this was heading. The first maybe half to 2/3 is very much a slow burn, but I love a slow burn. There was so much hunger and lust and confusing feelings on Lenore's part. But as the story went on, it almost felt like the queer elements were being used as a metaphor for Lenore's freedom from her role in society, rather than to actually tell a queer love story, if that makes sense. And then Carmilla just leaves for a big chunk of the story, which within the story does make sense. Lenore had to learn what she was capable of by herself, but for a book marketed as a sapphic romance, I just wanted so much more. So yeah, those are all of my thoughts. I definitely did not hate this book. It was really well written, and taken out of the context of its marketing and my goals for this video, it was really good. I ended up giving it 4 stars on Goodreads, but I'm honestly kind of leaning more towards a 3.5. I think the more I sit with it, the less I love it, but I'm gonna stick somewhere between a 3.5 and 4 for now and just round up. So where do we go from here? Obviously, I have not read every queer vampire book in existence, but I think it's safe to say that there is a lot of room for improvement, especially amongst the most popular in the genre. I think Hungerstone is by far the best one I read in this category, so I do recommend it, but it's just not quite all the way there for me, so I will continue my hunt. I think the next one on my list is House of Hunger by Alexis Henderson. I've never read anything by this author before, but I've heard a lot of people saying that they really like this one and that it is very sapphic, so I'm intrigued. But please let me know if you have any other queer vampire recommendations that you think I might like. I've also realized through making this video that I've only read vampire books from white authors, so maybe that is my issue. And because of that, House of Hunger is definitely on the top of my list. I do think I need a bit of a break from vampire books for a while, but I know once August and September roll around next year, I am going to be fiending for some vampires again. They are by far my favorite supernatural being in any type of media, so I really hope that one day I will find the perfect vampire book. Unfortunately, that day was not today. But regardless, I still really enjoyed reading Hungerstone, and I had so much fun researching and making this video, so I hope you guys enjoyed it too. I hope you have a great Halloween, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!